Alright, today I'm going to show you a little bit about my Ford Mustang. It's a 1999 Mustang GT that I just did a lot of work on, and kind of sucks that I had to do it because I just bought the car, but basically I put a new engine in it and I was having EFI problems when I got the car back together because of Ford's protection against theft system. The ECU was telling the fuel relay not to turn the fuel pump on, is what I think was happening. Otherwise, it could have been a bad fuel pump. I wasn't really sure, but any one of those things going wrong was out of my price range to fix at the time. I'm still in college. I work part-time for not much money. So once I got it back together and realized I had this fuel pump issue with my EFI, I decided to ditch the EFI and go with a carburetor that I had laying around. I made it work. I bought a $30 fuel pump, just a cheap auto parts store, Mr. Gasket fuel pump. That flows 35 gallons per hour, which is alright. It'll be fine for this car. So here's the car. It was kind of riced out when I bought it. The guy had put on this. One of the owners put on that spoiler. That's not original. It's a little bigger. There's a little body kit down here. Not a big fan of that. And the best of all is this steering wheel. And he had those stupid things that you buy at AutoZone and stick on your gas pedals, your gas pedal, brake, and clutch, that make you look retarded when people see them. They were gaudy. Anyways, here's the carburetor. It looks sketchier than it is, and I'll explain that. It's an Edelbrock 1406 carburetor, 4-barrel. It's got I actually think that's a 12-inch air cleaner. I don't know. Anyways, all I did to convert it to this was literally make an adapter out of wood and bolt it onto my carburetor. I had to do it like that because I had to drive to work the next morning and I didn't have the adapter laying around. Imagine that. I don't even know if they make a adapter readily available for bolting a 4-barrel carb onto your EFI intake. So I made my own out of wood, and that seems sketchy to a lot of people, but it's less sketchy than you think. You can actually buy wood carburetor spacers from Edelbrock that are made out of a similar wood to MDF. MDF is a flame retardant material. I coated it with silicone to make sure that the gasoline didn't deteriorate the thing, and the wood actually seals really well. That's one of the reasons they use it for things like that. The engine is from a 2003 Ford Crown Victoria. The 1999 to 2000 Mustang GTs were made in the Windsor plant, the same plant that the 351 and 50 Windsor motors were made in. And they are a little bit different than the other year Mustang engines. The 4.62 valves were made in 2 different factories, 3 if you count E6, but they're in the same plant as the Romeo block. There's a plant in Canada that makes the Windsor motor, and then there's another plant in Romeo, that's what it's called. I think it's in a town called ESX, EX, and it had an 8-bolt flywheel on it, and the valve covers are different. That's the real difference between the 2 engines. Not really that big of a deal, but I had an 8-bolt flywheel from a Windsor motor, and I had to put in this Romeo block because they're way easier to find for this car. And that wasn't that big of a deal either. The bolt patterns were really close. There were 6 main holes around the ring, spaced out evenly, and then 2 just drilled in there. It looked like they didn't really do anything. The bolt pattern for the 6 holes that I needed were really close to what I needed to bolt it to on the main for the Romeo block. I wound up drilling the holes out a little bigger, and it lined up just right and didn't wiggle when I put it on, and I figured I don't see that turning into an issue. I'm only making however much money or horsepower a stock Mustang makes. I don't have a lot of money put into this motor, but it's a good engine. It was easy to swap. I did it. It was my first try. I did it Pretty much by myself, me and my brother, who's not really that into cars or anything. He's not dumb though. That's the cherry picker I used right there. Borrowed that from my neighbor. It took me 4 days total to get this thing. Pulled it in, 4 days later, drove it out with the carburetor on it. Now I'm just fine-tuning things like fuel pressure. The fuel pressure on this Edelbrock carb is pretty sensitive. It's kind of an older carb, so maybe the seat for the float is not as tight as it should be. But on top of that, the Edelbrock carbs, although they say they can take up to 7 psi, they don't like it. 7 psi tends to keep the float open. It pushes down too hard on that needle, and it floods out the carb. I set my floats at 7/16, so that shouldn't be why it's flooding out. But if I let my car idle for a little while and let that fuel pressure build up, and I'm not consuming enough fuel to keep up with how much pressure is coming in, it's flooded out and it smokes really bad and all that jazz. It barely runs. So I'm putting on a fuel pressure regulator now, and that should help things a lot. Otherwise, I have new metering springs I'm going to put in. New step-up springs is what they're called. But the reason that I didn't mind going with the carb was because, one, EFI is expensive and hard to troubleshoot when it does break, and when it breaks, not if. Especially with a vehicle with a protection against theft system so finicky, I don't want to go out to my car and have it crank and crank and crank and no fuel's getting to it, but everything's fine. I'm not stealing it, it's my car. So I threw this carburetor on, and carburetors for a car enthusiast really aren't that bad of a deal. So you might have to work on your carburetor a little bit to get it tuned correctly, but a correctly tuned carburetor burning the same air-fuel ratio as an EFI unit will make more power and get better mileage when tuned correctly. The reason EFI is said to make more power and get better mileage is because it's always tuned correctly, but it has less potential. EFI basically shoots a stream of water into your engine, and it doesn't give it time to mix with the air and become atomized like it does, like a carburetor will. A carburetor, it shoots like a fog, just a fog of fuel and air into your engine. There's a lot of turbulence, it mixes it up, and it just makes it like a fine mist or a froth. It's very atomized when it gets in there. Fuel injection just pisses a puddle into your engine, and it works pretty well. But there's actually about a 10% difference in power at the wheels with a correctly tuned carburetor. I read in some magazine they did that, and they had the carburetor tuned for horsepower and they had the EFI system tuned for horsepower. So instead of burning a 14.7 air-fuel ratio, horsepower likes to be ran with an air-fuel ratio at around 13.5, 13.8, a little bit richer. And that's not that crazy of a concept, I suppose, especially if you can mix all that with the air. Fuel economy, 14.7 is where it's at. So my main jets are hopefully going to be running it at 13.5, and my metering rods are going to allow it to cruise at around 15 to 1 because I commute every day, and I don't really feel that sketchy about 15 to 1, especially if you run premium gas. So the carburetor is really not that bad of an option if you are having EFI problems. I mean, you'll have a 99 problems with your car like I do sometimes, but EFI won't be one. I really don't miss EFI, and I think that the carburetor makes my car a little bit more unique. And also I'm looking forward to having an air cleaner sticking out of my hood about this much, looking really hot rod, and my 99 GT, because everybody has new edge Mustang GTs. Every teenage girl's got a V6 automatic Mustang GT, and it's cool to be a little bit different on top of that. Plus the horsepower gains, the simplicity, the feeling of knowing what your car is doing and knowing that if it does go wrong, you can fix it with a $30 carb tuning kit or a $30 fuel pump and be all set to go, make it home. If you come out to your car and it's no crank, or it's no starting but cranking and sparking, and you have EFI, you pretty much have to tow that thing, and usually to a mechanic shop. so they can run a scanner, figure out what's wrong, all that jazz. You're gonna have a lot of downtime. I don't like downtime. I don't like taking my car to the mechanic, although I do like mechanics for a lot of things. But I prefer the independence that a carburetor brings. And the horsepower gains are there. The horsepower gains are real. If you tune your carb and are attentive to your car like most car enthusiasts will be, a carburetor is not that bad of an option. Now, if you're a soccer mom with a Mercedes that your husband bought you, so that way you didn't leave him after you got hotter from your boob job that he bought, EFI is not the way to go. Car guy though, EFI is where it's at in my opinion.